ship survivor gave interview in the 1930s that surfaced almost 90 years later. 60 years after the abolition of slavery, an anthropologist made a remarkable discovery. She located the last surviving slave on the last ship to bring Africans to the United States. In his own words, a heartbreaking story of a young African man who'd been kidnapped from his home, crammed into a boat for months, and sent off to America to be sold as a slave. In the 1930s, Zora, an anthropologist, conducted many interviews with the last survivor, but she'd struggled to find someone who would publish her findings in a book. Black emancipation was the last thing people were interested in reading about. In fact, they're only now being released to the public in a book. Zora's book tells the story of Cudjo, who was born in what is now the West African country of Benin. He was only 19 years old when members of the neighboring Dahomian tribe beat him, captured him, and took him to the coast to be sold off. A significant time in Cudjo's life, he was a young man who dreamt of marrying his childhood love and starting his own family. He'd known of friends and family who'd been kidnapped by slave traders and sent off to unknown lands, but he'd tried his best to evade them and was hopeful he would be one of the lucky ones. But he was wrong. Like most nights, after an evening meal with his parents and sisters, they would often exchange tribal folklore until the spell of sleep took over. But this night would be very different than others. This night would shatter lives. Cudjo and his family had finished their nightly tradition and were in the midst of sleeping when numerous men with swords barged into their home. Startled and terrified, Cudjo and his family asked them what they had wanted and demanded they leave. But there was no chance. They would not leave until they got what they'd come for. The men from the neighboring Dahomian tribe beat Cudjo and told him to say his goodbyes. There was no room or time for questions or objections. His family had been helpless to the merciless intruders. Cudjo looked at his family, especially his mama, knowing it would be the last time he would ever see them again. When Cudjo had been brought to the shore, as he looked around, men like himself stood on platforms, helplessly waiting to be sold. Within a few minutes, but what had seemed like days, Cudjo and about 120 others were sold into slavery and crammed into the Clotilda, the last slave ship to reach the continental United States. The Clotilda brought its captives to Alabama in 1860. Even though slavery was legal at that time in America, the international slave trade was not. America had outlawed the practice in 1807. But Cudjo Lewis's journey is an example of how slave traders went around the law to continue bringing over human cargo. To avoid detection from authorities, Cudjo's captors snuck him and the other survivors into Alabama at night. They were forced to hide in a swamp for several days. They sat quietly in the darkness and cold, awaiting their unknown fate. At this point, it had been several days that the fearful captives had battled hunger and thirst. But even then, they were still lucky to survive. Due to hunger, physical abuse, and filthy conditions, countless captives died on their voyages. To hide the evidence of their crime, the 86-foot sailboat was then set ablaze on the banks of the Mobile Tensaw Delta. Its remains have been uncovered in January 2018. This would guarantee destroying any possible trace of human cargo entering the country. Cudjo's narrative provides a first-hand account of the devastating trauma of slavery. His interview gave the world a magnified lens into the grim reality of the process of slavery and the forgotten horror of the voyages to unknown places. The captives spent several months crammed together during the treacherous passage to the United States, but they still were able to form friendships in the midst of their tragedy, only to be separated in Alabama to go to different plantations. After months crammed together in filthy conditions, there was still light to be found. In his own words, Cudjo describes dealing with the separation from the other captives who had become like his family. "We very sorry to be parted from one another," Cudjo told Zora. "We 70 days crossed the water from the Africa soil, and now they part us from one another, therefore we cry." But Cudjo's anguish is reflected the most when he speaks about his mom. During the interview with Zora, Cudjo could barely find the words to describe the emotions he's felt throughout his life when he thinks of her. He often stops the interview to cry. "My grief's so heavy, I can't stand it. I think maybe I die in my sleep when I dream about my mama." When Cudjo finally arrived at the slave plantation, No one spoke his language, nor could they explain to him where he was or what was going on. He only knew one thing, something that didn't require any language whatsoever. He knew he was a white man's property and forever enslaved to him. But while Cujo worked for years as a slave, something radical was happening in America that would forever change the course of its history. Cujo had no idea that the Civil War had begun, but partway through he began to hear that the North had started a war to free enslaved people like him. He dismissed the thought, thinking that day would never come. He'd lost all that was important to him, including his dignity. There was no room for hope in his mind. A few days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in April '65. One day when Cujo and other enslaved people were working on a boat, Union soldiers walked by and told them something Cujo never thought they'd ever hear. "You're free." Not sure where to go or simply what to do next, in a country that had been nothing but terrible to him, he didn't have a dollar in his pocket nor a place to sleep. Cujo expected to receive some sort of compensation for being kidnapped and forced into slavery, and was frustrated to discover that emancipation didn't come with the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Frustrated by the refusal of the government to provide him with land to live on after stealing him away from his homeland, he and a group of 31 other free people saved up money to buy land near the state capital of Mobile, which they called Africatown. Cujo would never see his family again, but dreamt about his mama until the day he died.